Alright guys, in this video I have a real treat for you. It's the King's Indian defense yet again, and as you might have noticed, we have already covered the same-ish variation. The F3 move here has been covered in a different video, so check out that line if you want to. In this video we'll cover Knight F3 or Bishop E2. Those lines very often transpose. I will cover on the the classical King's Indian in this video. Before moving on to castles, which is the obvious move in this position, I will just mention Bishop G4, which is a fun move to know. The strategy here for black here is to put pressure on white's weak point D4 by playing the moves Knight D7 and Knight C6 in some order. So this pin actually helps black adding more pressure on d4, because this bishop on g4 doesn't really contribute to putting pressure on d4 in the first place, but if it can exchange itself off against the knight on f3, then it will remove a defender from this pawn. So this is the point, as we can see. Castles now, bishop e3 for example, very normal moves. Knight f to d7, and these are the plans for black. Knight c6 and maybe even c5 or maybe even e5 as well to get control over the center and especially the d4 square. So rook c1 is white's best move here, and the point is actually to cover this knight on c3 to avoid double pawns. So if I sound Greek to you, I will show you the point of this. If castles, which is a perfectly fine move, then knight c6, d5, which might be tempting because you don't want to play something like this, as black will get a foothold in the center pretty fast, and this is basically a black's strategy here. You don't want to allow this. Something like this, for example, could look like a very nice and advantageous variation for white, but after a very simple move, like for example, let's say a6, just to prove a point, then the pawn on b2 would also be hanging, and if of course rook b1, we have an exchange of pawns yet again. Maybe even a5 is a good move here, but we could also just take on c4. And as we can see, black is enjoying the much better position here. And why is that? Well, he's up a pawn. The a pawn is of course free to move off the board, but also because the difference in bishops here and the quality of those minor pieces is just tremendous. Because first and foremost, this bishop is unrestricted. It's control over the a1 h8 diagonal is unparalleled in the position, so it's a dominant piece. This bishop is not really contributing to play at all, and besides, this knight can get really annoying on the queen side as well. This knight, however, lacks prospects, at least active prospects. So this is not recommendable for white to allow this kind of play, and that is why d5 is very often played here. Bishop f3, bishop takes, knight a5, threatening of course this guy on c4. We retreat to cover it, and now we can see the point of black strategy. Bishop takes c3, which is a very undogmatic move. I mean, you exchange off your fianchettoed bishop, which is quite an unusual thing to do, but in this position white's pawn structure is so damaged that black can actually afford to exchange his bishop off. And after e5, black enjoys a perfectly okay position. If the center is stays like this, locked and not very dynamic, then black will enjoy a very good position, because these bishops are not very good in closed positions, and these pawns might get attacked and weak eventually. So white should really take this en passant and go for something like f4 to open up the positions for the bishop here. This is a cool variation and good to know with black. So it's an alternative to the classical variations if that's too much for you. So castles here is the main move, the classical move. bishop e2, and now e5 is of course the point of black's fianchetto here, and the d6 move is to break in the center and establish control in the middle of the board. So we will take a look at castles shortly. This is the main move. I will start with the exchange variation of the King's Indian defense, which is considered a bit dry, but it contains some venom actually if you are unprepared with black, so it should be checked. And it's been played by many good players over the years, and a friend of mine, Vegard Ganrud from Norway, a FIDE master, he's enjoyed great success with this variation actually. So it can be very effective, especially against higher rated opponents who take risks to generate winning chances. You take on d8 and bishop g5, and of course your threat is knight d5 with a pin towards the rook. So this is the point of white's strategy. How to counter this for black? Well, there are many options. c6 is not so clear because winning the pawn back on e4 is not so easy. Because white has this move long castles, and of course if you take on e5 then rook d8 is played with tremendous effect, and now rook e8 and you can take on f6, and you're bound to have this endgame with black, a pawn down. So this is not the best scenario. So knight a6 to develop and to play something like knight c5, put pressure here. Not a real feast either for black. Rook d6, threatening this one. Bishop e6, f4, knight c5, bishop f3, and it's not so easy to regain the pawn, even though you have some play connected to h6 and g5 here. It's not so easy to handle this position for black. So I would recommend avoiding this, but this is definitely a scenario white would be reasonably happy to get in a practical game. Going a bit back, I can just mention quite shortly that knight takes e5 in this position is not recommendable. It doesn't really give white any chances to play for activity, because knight takes e4 is equalizing just on the spot, and it's very easy equalizer. You cannot take on f7 here and then plan to take on e4, because bishop takes c3. This little intermezzo ruins the party for white. Now a full piece down in the endgame. So you need to recapture on e4, but then bishop takes e5, and this position is no fun. So I would not recommend going for this. So after queen takes d8, rook recaptures, bishop g5. What else to do here with black? Well, rook e8 is probably considered the easiest move for black to equalize here. So the plan is still to play something like c6, maybe even knight c6, but anyway to keep white from winning this pawn on e5, and then of course try to center your play around control of the d4 squares. We can see just a couple of lazy moves here for white just to illustrate my point. So a scenario like this, for example, would be very nice for black. And if white wants to exchange pieces and trade in the center, we have this beautiful move, bishop d8. And after another tame move here, knight d4, we play c6 in the next move. The bishop comes around to b6, and this is a dream scenario for black. If you want to play for win, this is an excellent position. So you should really avoid this with white, because now positionally black is doing very well, and in this exchange variation this bishop is not a minor piece you want to be left with white, because this bishop is very often quite bad because it moves on the same squares as two of your central pawns. So this bishop is practically useless here. So avoid this, guys. This is not a good way to play. So rook e8, knight d5 immediately is considered the best move for white. We take this, of course, and play c6 to break up in the center. If white wants to help us develop our knights, then we accept. But bishop c4 is the best move. cd, bishop takes d5, and knight d7. Lots of options the next couple of moves for white. Knight d2 is considered to be white's best move here, and there are many options for black in the coming moves. This position is reasonably equal, I think, practically dead equal, but still, even though it's equal, that doesn't mean it's a draw, because there are many options to play for win here, and it can be a long and interesting game. So feel free to check out this variation if you're up for that, and if you enjoy especially endgames, this variation is very nice. However, if you want to play more complicated and dynamic chess, then castles is the right move for you. I will just briefly mention that there are two alternatives to knight c6, which is the main move. Knight a6, planning these three moves in some order, is a very complicated, and previously it was quite popular. It's been played by many good players, including Luke McShane, for example. E takes d4, also a good move. Knight takes, and then rook e8, f3, protecting the pawn, and then c6, or even knight c6 is also a move, but with c6 planning the central break d5 is probably one of the most complicated variations in the King's Indian. Feel free to check out this variation. Black, of course, has a potentially very weak pawn on d6, but again, the promise of active play in the center is enough to persuade many strong players to go for this position with the black pieces. Very double-edged stuff. Check that out if you want to play it. It's a very demanding position, but so are many positions in the King's Indian defense. Knight c6, d5 played. This variation, this is the delayed exchange variation. This is not as interesting or as dangerous as the real exchange variation as we just reviewed. Can still be played, of course, and it's not exactly losing for white in any way, but it's not considered very dangerous. But it does contain some venom. It's been played by, amongst others, Ponomaryov against Nakamura, and he actually managed to beat the American with this variation. That's really telling. And it's also played by the Chinese Grandmaster Li Chao. I think he's drawn against both Topalov and Ding Liren, his compatriot in this line. So check out the delayed exchange variation if you want to do that. d5 is the main move, and the move we will consider in this video. Knight e7, and now a real crossroads, a really difficult decision to make now for white, how to proceed. Two main variations here that I will review. I can just briefly mention that bishop g5, knight d2 are both very reasonable variations. Even a4 has been played at a very high level. Just wanted to gain some space on the queen side, but b4, the bayonet attack, or the Mar del Plata knight e1. These are the main moves for white. I'll start with the bayonet attack, popularized by Vladimir Kramnik some years ago, played by many strong players. And this is an old favorite of mine, actually. So this is definitely something you could enjoy with white, but the black position is also quite sound. a5 is considered one of the best moves for black here. I can just mention that knight h5 is the most popular line. Trying to go for knight f4, or maybe even f5. So rook e1, f5. Knight g5, knight f6, and bishop f3, and now c6, and this is super complicated stuff. I would not recommend going for a position like this if you haven't checked out at least some lines on your own. I can just mention that this is the starting point for one of the most complicated variations of the bayonet attack against the King's Indian defense. That's a very long title for this variation, but check it out. It's cool, it's fascinating, and it really sums up the complexities of the King's Indian defense. b4 a5 also played. Bishop a3, a move found originally by Vladimir Kramnik, I think. The point is just to force through c5, which is white's main plan against the King's Indian in this variation. You want to play on the queen side with white, while black wants to attack on the king side with f5. Those are the main plans. AB, bishop b4, b6 to stop, of course, c5 from being played. So a4, we want to break on the queen side. And if we are allowed to play a5 and open up the queen side, then that very often is enough to distract black from attacking on the king side with f5. So rook e8 is a move here as well. The point is that a5 is not so good now because c5 is a move. We cannot retreat because this pawn will be hanging, so we have to take en passant. Knight takes, and of course luckily we have a bishop takes d6. But now after a move like, for example, knight d4, but also the very simple rook takes a5, rook takes, and a knight takes, then the position is very equal and of course fully playable for both colors. Could still happen a lot here in this position, but the position is clarified and probably more to black's taste here. You could take on e5, but after a subsequent exchange of queens, then the typical knight e4 exchanging mechanism is seen. If you take on g7, then we can just take back, so that's not so dangerous. A knight takes e4. We take back, rook d8, king g7, and in this very clarified position, a draw is the most likely result. So if that's something you'd like to go for, then feel free. I'm not going to recommend it, but the bayonet attack is very rich in ideas, and of course in this position you don't have to go for a5. You could play the main move rook e1 just to keep the tension. Now a5 is suddenly possible, so black should be careful. So bishop f8 has actually been played just to cover the d6 square and pawn even more. So many of black's moves here are proactive against this a5 c5 plan for white. Bishop f1, white is still trying to wait because a5 is still met by c5, and now black plays c5. Anyway, instead of taking now, because the d6 pawn is protected, we can retreat to a3. Bishop h6, trying to, of course, trade off this bishop because we imagine white wants to regroup to c1. And I've drawn up some typical plans here for both players. Rook f8, f5 is still black's plan in the King's Indian, also in this line. While white still wants to put pressure on the queen side by either forcing through a5 or winning the b6 pawn. So these are my suggestions in the bayonet variation and the bayonet attack, as it's called, against the King's Indian. Now it's time for a very short review of the Mar del Plata variation, d5, knight e7, and now knight e1, which is probably the most complex line. So knight d7 is the most common line. I'll check this line for you. Black wants to play f5 immediately, while of course white wants to force through these pawn breaks here on the queen side and to win the battle on the queen side. So bishop e3, f5. We don't want to exchange and open up the position too much in front of our own king. We want to keep it closed. So f3 is white's move. f4, bishop f2. And here there are many different moves, but g5 is definitely the most logical. Two plans here for black. Either you go for rook f6 and to deliver mate immediately, which could be very dangerous, or h5, which is considered the best try in conjunction with probably an early knight g6. So knight g6 first probably. I will check rook c1, which is a good move for white, the main move. Now rook f6 is well, a sort of caveman style, going for mate immediately. Very different moves here to make for white, but c5 is very logical. We are protecting with both knight and bishop, so opening up here for black would not make sense because white would be very quick on the queen side. So queen e8 is black's move, but after knight b5, queen h5, it's very difficult to be on your toes here with white. h3, then knight f6, followed by bishop takes h3 is a very typical and beautiful King's Indian defense sacrifice, which will win black the game. I mean, the king on g1 will be completely defenseless, but it can escape because the rook is blocking, so black will be winning. But instead of h3 in this variation, sorry, I will just go through this very quickly again. Knight e1, and if you can remember, these are the moves. g5, and here we are, finally. Sorry guys, took me a couple of seconds. Instead of going h3 and being mated after a bishop sacrifice on h3, then h4 actually is very good for white, and this is something you must know if you face this mechanism, this method of trying to deliver mate. h4 is very important to know. So if black takes, then we can just play king h2, and if h3, then g4 is just very good and very safe for white. The queen side is falling and there's no mate here for black. Rook g1 is very safe, and c7, d6 is falling, so this is very good for white. Black could of course play something else here, could play knight to g6, but then g4 still is a very good move. And now after something like knight f4, could also take this of course, but after knight c7, white is actually winning. There's no mate on h1 because the king can always escape, so this is not so dangerous for white, believe it or not. And the knight is going to e6, where it's blocking black's coordination completely. Knight f4 is of course possible, but again we take on c7, black must save the rook, and we take on d6, and as we can see, the black attack is sort of shrinking here, but you shouldn't rest here with white, even though a move like king h1 is beautiful, because black can never take on h4 with a piece here because of the bishop, and if you take with the pawn, then of course the entire attack is blocked by the black pawn that functions as a shield for white almost. So this is not really a correct way of playing with black, but it's a way of playing that can give you many victories in blitz if white is not careful. So the best move is knight g6. And now there are many options for white here. You could go for knight d3 to get in this c5 move. As we can see, rook f7 is played to protect c7, and here there are many moves. c6 for example is a move, knight b5 is a move, a4 is a move, many different variations for white to try here. I would leave it to you to figure out the nuances and of course which variation is your favorite. But rook f7 is a very proactive and good move to just bolster the queen side before going for the kill on the king side. Very often black continues with something like bishop f8 to continue to defend the queen side, and maybe even regroup with rook g7, h5, g4, and suddenly the attack starts to roll on the king side. So this position actually requires some nuance and some patience for black as well, while white wants to play something like king h1, maybe even rook g1, if you want to counter this long-term strategy for black. Of course, the point here is maybe to play g3 to break up the king side before black gets its attack going. You could also do something like this, but that's a different strategy. So if h5 here, then of course c6 is a move, but I really like g3, trying to say that, okay, this attack of yours with g5 and h5 is actually just helping me. So this is very interesting. So f takes, you could do bishop e3 here, an in-between move, so to speak, but rook g3 is also a very good move just to attack this pawn, and in this position I rather like white's chances. So instead of going h5, black should maybe consider something else. Maybe even rook g7 is a good start, and then after a while go for h5. So b4 h5 is a fine strategy here for both players, and maybe c6, maybe even g3 is still good for white, just to keep black at bay on the king side. So just to summarize, guys, this was the classical variation of the King's Indian with both the bayonet attack for white and the Mar del Plata variation, both very complicated. And we also reviewed the exchange variation quite shortly, which is fine if you want to have a sort of endgame like opening variation in your repertoire, that's also something you could consider. So in the previous video I also reviewed the same-ish variation for white against the King's Indian Defense, that's F3. Check that out if you'd like. This was our second video on the King's Indian Defense. Best of luck with the opening, guys, and I'll see you soon.